I'd like to introduce our moderator, my colleague, Cristian Dona Rebeco, PhD, Director of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, and Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Cristian, thank you so much for agreeing to put this panel together and moderating. There you are, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. For some reason, my background is lopsided, so I'll...
No, it looks correct on our screen.
Okay, good.
Yes, the mirroring of the images is funny.
I've only using backgrounds in the last year and a half, so this is the first time I use one. That's why I don't know how it looks.
It looks perfect.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Josie. And thank you very much for inviting me and inviting us to develop this panel. Should I introduce the participant, or do you want to introduce the presenters? Sorry.
So once you get started with the introduction, I would let the presenters control their own screens and share for PowerPoint. You should be all set up for that, but we're here if you have any issues. Don't worry.
Wonderful. So this morning we're going to talk about mobility mostly in Nebraska and in other parts of the country. As director of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies for the last 4 years, one of our tasks is to develop research, community engaged research, and community relevant research on Latinos in the state and in the region mostly. On that end, for the last 3 years, I've been very lucky to work with some wonderful colleagues on different analysis of the life of Latinos in Nebraska and in the U.S. We've just presented a report on human trafficking and Latin American immigrants, which will be presented by Dr. Teresa Kulig. And we've also been working with Dr. Barbara Gomez, Dr. Tom Jameson, and with our research assistant, Dakota Caldwell, on analyzing the impact of COVID on Latinos using specific database that they are going to introduce to you. That particular research started as a couple of years ago, thinking about the impact of crisis, and we were thinking at the time of the impact of the floods of the Missouri on the lives of Latinos. Obviously, in the last year and a half, that switched really rapidly to the impact of COVID for obvious reasons. So that's where the origins of that research is. Now I'm going to introduce each of our presenters. This session talks about mobility, but also brings not only quantitative data based on surveys, but also qualitative data that Dr. Kulig and another colleague of ours have gathered in the last year using in-depth interviews. So there's 2 different sets of data that you're going to be able to observe and how they've been used. So not to enter the most important and interesting part of the presentation, I would like to introduce my colleagues. First of all, Dr. Teresa Kulig. Dr. Kulig is an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at UNO. Her research focuses on the nature of human trafficking and theories of victimization and measurement. Next, Dr. Barbara Gomez Aguinaga. And Dr. Gomez Aguinaga is an assistant professor of public policy and social equity at the School of Public Administration at UNO. Her research examines the way in which race, politics, and media impact the public policymaking process in the United States. Her current research projects examine the outcomes of health, immigration, and criminal justice policies on communities of color, with emphasis on Latinos immigrants. Dr. Gomez Aguinaga is also faculty with the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies. Dr. Thomas Jameson is an assistant professor at the School of Public Administration at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. His research draws from political psychology, political communication, and behavioral economics to better understand how people think, feel, and behave during periods of crisis. And last but not least, Dakota Caldwell, our research assistant, he has a master's of public affairs. He's a doctoral student at School of Public Administration, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and his research focuses on social equity, social class, and epistemological reality. So let the presenters do their job, which it's far more interesting than what I'm going to be saying. Teresa, please, if you want to start us.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Christian. Let me get my screen all set up, which is always a task for me. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that screen okay and hear me okay? I feel like we always need to do like the quick check in before we get going.
Good morning, Teresa. You are good to go.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Josie. And thank you so much again for that wonderful introduction. So today I'm really excited to talk to you all today about a project that I've been working on with Christian and another colleague, Alicia Novak. And so I want to review here a qualitative approach of qualitative interviews and research to really illustrate its usefulness from a recent project that Christian was just talking about. And so here I've provided a roadmap of the presentation, moving from a brief overview of a qualitative approach, very brief, through our research study method and findings, and then some summary points. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing here, looking at a brief overview, is quantitative versus qualitative data, which Christian had brought up. And so, quantitative, we're thinking statistical, typically structured to count or quantify events, whereas qualitative, it can use different methods. It could be interviews, it could be observations, it could even be document analysis to really, the point being to yield really detailed descriptions of experiences and perceptions. And so for here, I'm going to be referring to qualitative interviews. And so the benefits of conducting qualitative interviews is that you can, again, gather these rich insights from participants, but it also really allows flexibility with interview questions, which are usually semi-structured. You have a template, but they're left open-ended to allow for really in-depth data collection. And conducting qualitative research is completed in a number of steps, and I've outlined just some of the broad steps here that need to be taken. But each of these steps require decisions that should really be shaped by the research being conducted, the research questions you're trying to ask. And so it can be complicated in times and sometimes complex. Now, in the context of our study, we were interested in learning about human trafficking victims' experiences with our legal system. And so human trafficking, and I'm referring to it here as involving sex or labor exploitation, we know that some individuals tend to be more vulnerable to trafficking than others. And undocumented immigrants, we know, tend to have this added layer of vulnerability due to their lack of legal status. And so this can make it easier for traffickers to identify, recruit, and exploit these individuals who may not be aware of the legislation or the customs or even the language when they come to the United States. Not only that, but the lack, again, of protective legal status that they may have. And so in response to this, our government actually created what's known as a T visa to provide additional protections to foreign national victims of human trafficking. And the visa offers protection to victims if they're approved, and it strengthens the ability of law enforcement to investigate and prosecute these crimes. And so, for example, some benefits of the T visa include being allowed to remain in the United States for several years if they participate in the investigation and prosecution of their perpetrators. They can be granted work authorizations. They can be offered protections for qualifying family members, and they can also be eligible to apply for lawful permanent residence after several years or once the investigation and prosecution is complete. So it's really beneficial to put into place some of those protections for people who've been seriously harmed, which is all great. However, we know very little about individuals who go through to apply for the T visa, to know the outcomes of those efforts. And so that is what our study sought to address. And so here is just a cover sheet of our study, and I'll be providing a link to the full technical report at the end of this presentation if you're interested in doing a deeper dive into all of our findings. So in considering how to go about this process to gain this rich information from individuals about the T visa process, we chose to interview legal representatives. And we chose to take this route because they have intimate knowledge of the T visa process. They are subject matter experts, and they also are in this unique position to identify human trafficking victims during legal consultations. And so we focused on legal representatives in Nebraska who have worked with victims from Latin America specifically to file a T visa application. Now, our study combined a use of purposive and snowball sampling, and essentially we selected people who were known to us, given the narrow scope of this. We selected people who were known to us, who work with individuals from Latin America, and we also asked them whether or not they knew anyone who could be eligible to participate in our study. And through this method, we had identified 16 legal representatives who could be eligible to participate. And of those 16, 6 individuals actually agreed to participate. And those interviews that we conducted, we gained rich insights into discussions on 22 victims of human trafficking from Latin America who had gone through either consultation or so on with the T visa process. So getting to the interview process here, that we had to develop a protocol, we had to organize this, and we did this in a couple of steps. And the first step was really to examine past research and interviews with legal professionals to incorporate any of that information that was useful for our research questions. And then we also added new topics for the current study. So for example, we asked about the legal representative's background. We wanted to know more about the agency. We wanted to know about each victim's own trafficking experience, their T visa process, any post-trafficking details, the integration of service providers in Nebraska, as well as the legal representative's own perceptions of barriers to responding to trafficking and how we might go about improving those responses. And we scheduled and conducted these semi-structured interviews via Zoom between August and October of 2020. We did it via Zoom because, of course, the pandemic restricted some of our ability to do face-to-face interviews, but it actually worked out really well. So that was great. On average, our interviews lasted about an hour and 48 minutes. So it shows the richness of the amount of information, how long we were able to talk with participants. And one interview was even split up into several sessions, lasting a total of about 6 hours. So again, seeing the in-depth nature of trying to gather this information is really a neat thing to be able to do to learn more about this topic. We audio recorded the interviews with permission from the participants because we wanted to capture verbatim the language that they used, so we could make sure that our transcriptions were accurate and for future data analysis. And for their participation, we did pay all participants a $50 Visa gift card. So analyzing this, so once we go through, we found our sample, we have now conducted our interviews, the data analysis. The interviews are actually transcribed by Zoom, which was something I wasn't aware of before this project. But then again, we also checked that against the audio recording for accuracy. We then uploaded those transcription files to Max QDA software. We organized the cases based on the T visa status, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, and the trafficking type. So was it sex trafficking? Was it labor trafficking? Or was this somebody who experienced both sex and labor trafficking? We then used thematic analysis, and the goal here being to try to identify patterns of meaning in the data set and to group those similarities within the broader categories of our interview protocol, those groupings of which I told you of how we kind of developed some of those questions. And then 2 of the authors then reviewed and coded categories independently because we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss any details or miscode any details in that process. So here I've outlined a few findings to illustrate the usefulness of this approach. And again, the full findings are available in the technical report, but I wanted to really highlight some of these rich insights that we can gather from a qualitative interviews. The first here is that of the victims talked about by the legal representatives, a number had already filed their application and they were currently waiting on the results, whereas some individuals had filed and already received approval. Others had not filed, they were still in that consultation phase, and then a smaller proportion were actually denied the T visa. Now, other insights going through some of these themes that we gathered was the fact that the legal representatives really talked about difficulty sometimes in getting that law enforcement certification or certification that the victim had actually assisted with the investigation and or prosecution of their perpetrators, which is really important for the T visa application. And so there was conversation around investigators not always being supportive. And so lack of support looked like the certification just wouldn't be discussed at all. They would be ignored when they would request the certification or to talk about it, or the law enforcement agencies wouldn't sign off on the certification until after prosecution was complete, which can take some time to get to that stage. We also learned about challenges in filing the T visa application. So legal representatives talked about it was difficult proving cases met the legal definition of human trafficking. Health issues of the victims affected their memory of the events, which made it difficult for them to recall what happened. There were court delays and investigations. There was lack of support by agencies to investigate labor trafficking cases specifically. And there were also language and cultural barriers that affected their ability to gather information to add it to the T visa application. And finally, we also discussed hardship. So what would happen to these individuals if the T visa was not granted? And the main concerns here were deportation and going back to the home country where maybe they were initially vulnerable and or trafficked, and also retaliation by traffickers if they found out that they had assisted in this investigation, even though the T visa was never granted. So one of the important aspects of the research then is that it can also highlight some key themes and areas that might require additional research. And so here I outline a few implications, including the need to work with law enforcement to better understand the T visa certification from their perspective. So legal representatives, talked about the challenge in working with law enforcement at times, but we know very little about law enforcement side of applying and going through this process as well. So that could be really important to see this holistically. Also, the need to provide law enforcement and first responders with training and tools to investigate these crimes, particularly the need to train on the T visa process and what that looks like and what's needed. And also calling, which has been called around the country recently, the need to recognize signs of labor trafficking as well. And we also want to ensure the prompt adjudication of T visa cases so victims are not in limbo, so they know what they can do. Is it going to be approved? Is it not? What other information do I need? Because these processes can be quite lengthy. Okay, so just a couple of summary points to consider when thinking about using a qualitative design in light of what we were able to use this for and the rich insights we were able to gather. And that is really that no one study, including ours, should be the final word on a topic, but qualitative research can really give us these rich insights where maybe we don't have a lot of research or we don't really know a lot about an area, and it can give guidance on what direction we should go. And the other point here is that semi-structured interviews can really give organization to our interview. And it can also provide participants with this voice because we have certain questions we want to ask about, but they're open-ended. So it allows for this in-depth data collection by researchers on topics that maybe we didn't think about. And that did come up in our study as well, of different themes that emerged when we let participants also bring up topics that were important to them. And finally, this is a really flexible approach. I mean, it can adapt to various research questions and projects. It allows for different sampling and interviewing strategies, is applicable depending again on the needs, the goals of a research project. And so it was a really neat thing to be able to work on with some great scholars. And as promised, here is a link which will be given in the PowerPoints later of the full technical report and executive summary on the website, on UN Omaha's website. And of course, I would be happy to answer any questions at the end. So thank you so much.
Many thanks, Teresa, for that wonderful presentation. Sorry, let me turn off my timer. I'm gonna put the link also on the chat for anyone who wants to see the report. There's also a executive summary and a blog post that summarizes the entire report in case you want to read something shorter before getting to the long report. Next, Dr. Barbara Gomez Aguinaga, Dr. Tom Jameson, and Dr. Caldwell will present on two different analyses or two different perspectives of analysis from one same database that we've been working on to analyze the impact of COVID-19 on Latinos in the United States. Barbara?
Yeah. So hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. So yeah. So you should, perfect. So I'm assuming that now you all can see my slides. And I'm working with our team that Christian was just mentioning. But before we talk about our analysis, I wanted to give you a brief overview on the relationship between health and human mobility. Before we start, I want to clarify that with migration or human mobility, we refer to both internal migration, like people moving within the United States to a different city or state, as well as external migration or immigration, which is the type that Dr. Kulig was talking about, with foreign-born people moving to the United States in our scenarios. So that being said, when we now I'm going to talk about health, and when we typically think about typically discuss health, we think about the absence of sickness, especially physical sickness. But we know that health is a very encompassing concept. As the World Health Organization, health is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, instead of merely being the absence of disease or infirmity. So, you know, this definition comes from the World Health Organization, and, you know, sometimes the definition provided by international organizations might be very different from the one from the United States. But this is this definition of health is a fairly universal concept or accepted concept, because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, which is an agency under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, defines health as any type of resource that allows people to realize their aspirations, satisfy their needs, and cope with the environment in order to live a long, productive, and fruitful life. And this definition applies equally to migrants and non-migrants. But when we think about migrants, obviously being healthy is a necessary condition for migrants to work and be productive. And not only that, but also to contribute socially and economically to their new communities. So as you can imagine, based on the definition, health is not a concept that is isolated in a vacuum. In fact, there are many factors and conditions that contribute and influence the health of migrants. And these factors and conditions are called the social determinants of health, which are not just, they go beyond physical health, and they're the conditions in the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, etc., that affect a wide range of health functioning and quality of life outcomes and risks. And this definition comes from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And as you can see here, there are multiple determinants of health. One of them, obviously, and it's pretty obvious, it's healthcare access and quality, because we know that if in the US context, if you have health insurance, then you're more likely to access health services, and that at the same time translate to better health outcomes in the long run. Besides that, education access and quality is also a determinant of health, because studies have continuously shown that people with higher levels of education are more likely to have healthier lives and live longer. Another very important determinant of health is economic stability, because we know that steady incomes allow families to meet their health needs, including, I don't know, like food, shelter, housing, and many other needs that we all have in order to have a fruitful life. One of the less known social determinants of health is social and community context, which is pretty much people's relationships with their families and community members. And that has been proven that it can have a major impact on people's health and well-being. And here is where some folks experience challenges and dangers in their community that they can control, like unsafe neighborhoods, threats, trouble with affording their necessities. And this is one of the reasons why many people decide to move and migrate to new communities. Related to that point, neighborhood and built environment is also a social determinant of health, because we know that unfortunately many Americans live in neighborhoods with high rates of violence, unsafe air or water, and other health and safety risks. And that is a driver for migration. And when we think about all these determinants, studies have shown that the conditions surrounding migration and human mobility internationally or domestically often fuel health inequalities, often exposing migrants to health risk and negative health outcomes in the short and long term. So that's why I'm going to talk about factors that influence the health of migrants, and not only migrants themselves, but also their families or immediate family members. So there's 4 different phases of migration. And throughout this, there are multiple factors that influence the health and well-being of migrants and their families along these 4 phases. The first phase, as you can see here, is the pre-migration phase, which happens before actually moving somewhere else. So pre-migratory events and trauma, such as conflicts, human rights violation, for environmental quality, like living close to factories or mines, have been proven to impact migrants' health as well as their family members' health. Movement phase is the second phase of migration. And this is when pretty much the journey of moving from place A to place B happens. So there are multiple factors that influence the health in this phase, including the duration, circumstances, and conditions of the journey. When we think about health outcomes throughout moving to place A to place B, a 6-hour flight, it's going to be pretty different from jumping in a train from Central America to the United States. And also the circumstances during the journey matter, because along the trip, migrants can face abuses, violence, and exploitation, as Dr. Coley was talking earlier in her presentation. And also, if you think about that, if migrants face or experience a long journey with precarious conditions, then they're likely to have detrimental access to their health necessities throughout the movement phase. The next phase in the migration journey is arrival and integration phase. And this is when migrants make it to their new communities. And there are multiple factors that influence the health of migrants upon their arrival and integration to their new communities. One of them is migration policies. As Dr. Coley was talking about, there are some policies addressing human trafficking, but that can be many others, like including how we treat undocumented immigrants, how we treat asylum seekers in the United States, and even within communities inside the United States. Integration and access to services is also a factor that influences the health of immigrants. These type of services and integration aspects can be as basic as getting a driver's license in the MPD, register to vote, and even enrolling children to school or healthcare programs. And this is something to keep in mind, because when we think about vulnerable migrants, they can face very serious challenges when, for example, they don't have the paperwork necessary to access these services. Also, family separation matters because workers, even within the same state, moving to rural counties for work. In the case of Nebraska, some members of the community moved to rural areas to work in meat pack facilities. That can lead to family separation across countries, and that has been shown to have detrimental impacts. Family separation has detrimental impacts among communities. And the last phase, it is kind of like an optional phase, and not all the migrants face it, is when they return, is the returning phase, pretty much going back to their place of origin. And some of the factors that influence the health of migrants here is how long migrants were gone. It matters a lot, right? And also how many resources their place of origin has, because oftentimes when migrants go back to their place of origin, they have less quality and access to health services, education, employment opportunities, more detrimental environmental conditions. And as we saw earlier, those are determinants of health. Another important aspect in the returning phase that impacts health is the remaining ties. Sometimes migrants go back home, but due to conflicts like wars or even natural disasters, as we've had in the United States, most community families are gone because they're also trying to, survive. So now that we know the factors that influence the health of migrants, not just at one stage, but throughout the migration process, I wanted to share some sources for assessment of health and human mobility. That way, if you're interested in getting more information on that, could help your organization fulfill the need for information, you can do that. The first one is, traditional data sources at the national level. And these traditional data sources are administrative data sources like census, or also like the ACS or the American Community Survey that CPR has fantastic access and resources for information within the state of Nebraska, and that information can be broken down by even counties. So those are really two great sources, the census and the ACS. Also, at the national level and local level, you can look for information in health in institution-based records. That could be, for example, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, WISCARS, which stands for Web-Based Injury Statistics Reporting System, or something like that. And for example, CDC in this database, it has a very comprehensive data sets that breaks down health data at the national, state, and even local levels. So that is a great source for you. And we know that the CDC also has a data source on global migration and quarantine. They have a really good software application that shows foreign-born populations, census demographic data, and health data indicators to the US at the county level as well. So that is traditional resources usually at the national level, which usually come from the government or governmental agencies. But we also have a little bit more independent sources, which typically come from non-governmental organizations. One of them is a migration integration policy and the migration data portal. These two NGOs have data sets that allow you to access information on migration, for the most part internationally, but we know that there's substantial information of the US context. The Migration Policy Institute, they have an integration policy and law section that provides information on health and policies that allow for the integration of immigrants and their well-being. So Migration Policy Institute is a really fantastic source, and they have really good information on the intersection between health and migration, specifically immigration. And then if you want something more local, we have the Heartland Forward, which they recently published a report about the emergence of global health in the Heartland. It was published last month, and it has really great information about migration and its social and economic implications on multiple aspects such as health, education, economy, and so on. So this is the Health Forward report is a really great source for you if you're looking at Nebraska specifically. And then the third type of resource come from the International Organization for Migration. Again, these two data sources, the Migration Health Research Portal and the Migration Health Evidence Portal for COVID-19, have an emphasis on international migration, but they do have a section on US migration. You might not find domestic migration, but there is some really good information on international migration to the United States, and they have this fantastic resource now with information on COVID-19. And last but not least, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to tell you that research studies and reviews on migrant health can help you understand these dynamics better. Obviously, if you're into academic journals, I encourage you to look into special issues on immigration and health, but I have to acknowledge that might be too academic for everyone. So for that reason, there's other resources that kind of like make it easier for the average, make it more the information more digestible for practitioners and the public. Health Affairs Sunday Update is pretty good at health in general. It is not focused on migration or immigration, but it has great studies on health and human mobility here and there. Another is the Interdisciplinary Association for Population Health Science. They have a blog, and this blog is pretty good because researchers share their main findings and takeaways, as well as kind of like the broader implications of the research. So that being said, and with those resources in mind, I'm going to pass it to my colleagues, Tom and Dakota, who will talk about one of our studies on human mobility in economic and health outcomes.
Thank you, Barbara. So this is next one. We're going to kind of have a joint presentation between me and Dr. Jamison. He is going to talk a little bit about qualitative data, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have done with our research so far. So let me get my screen ready. Okay. All right. So to kind of give you a roadmap before I turn it over to Tom to talk about our data set and qualitative data, just kind of a roadmap or plan for our presentation. So first, we're going to be talking about how to use qualitative data, kind of the benefits, and talk a little bit about our data set and how we kind of went about using it in order to hopefully be beneficial if you have a data set that you are looking to work with, or if you are just exploring data sets that you could potentially work with later. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about our motivations for study, generally around like Nebraska during COVID and the situation of Latinos during COVID-19. And then we're going to talk a little bit about adapting theory and some of the theories and concepts that we used and how we might, actually take them through kind of the qualitative data, and then kind of present some of our preliminary findings. And then at the end, we'll have, references that we use for some of our research that will be at the end. And then whenever this presentation is provided for you, if you want to look at any of those, you can. So first, I'll turn it over to Tom, and he will talk to you a little bit about using qualitative data sets.
Yes, thanks very much, Dakota. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks very much for having us. It's a great panel, and it's a real pleasure to speak with you today. So our main data set involves using the UAS panel, or probability-based online panel from the University of Southern California. So I think this is an underutilized resource so far in academic studies and also in policy work as well. This is a huge data set that's been started in 2014 and has been going on since then. And with the coronavirus pandemic, they've also launched a kind of separate study going on at the same time that we've used for our research that looks at specific variables relating to COVID-19 and economic, social, health effects of COVID-19, as well as things like attitudes about vaccinations. There's a wide range of questions that they ask, and it's a great resource. And it's something that we've been using for our research, but I also recommend it for your own research as well, because it's freely available. So you just have to log in, set up an account, and then this data is freely available for you. It's a probability-based online panel, as I mentioned. So, the data set that we're working with has over 140,000 observations with a wide amount of variables, as I mentioned earlier. And they have over 9,000 panel members taking surveys at regular intervals. So you can also track changes over time as well. And they have longitudinal panel studies, which are freely downloadable. Another benefit of this data set is that it's also very clean for quantitative study. Often, you have to clean the data and spend a lot of time making it suit your purposes. But this data set is actually really nice and easy to use. It's quite intuitive in the way that they've coded variables. And they also have a wide amount of files available to help you kind of walk through what variables and what questions are asked in each wave of the survey and how to make sense of that. Another benefit of this study is also that all questions, materials, and sampling is conducted in both English and Spanish. And even though the vast majority of responses are in English, we used this, for instance, to kind of think through how language proficiency might be measured. So if a participant used Spanish to complete the study, then we used that as kind of a proxy variable for language proficiency and perhaps kind of language or linguistic barriers to receiving information or things like that. So it's a great data set that I think is really underutilized. I don't think it's publicized enough, and it's something that we've used in our study. And I'm looking forward to our discussion about the work, and Dakota is now going to take us through the motivations for our study, as well as what we some preliminary findings from this work.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate you going over kind of the data set for us. And I'd like to add to, with this data set, I believe there's 25 waves total that we have used. And so, there's again, just a mass amount of data out there with this survey. So it's very beneficial, and the questions that they ask, there's plenty of variables that we haven't used. So there could be multiple purposes you could find with this data set. So generally, some of the motivations that we had when we were looking to research human mobility, we were specifically interested, in Nebraska and the general region, particularly because of meatpacking plant epidemics, which I think Barbara touched on just a little bit, and where meatpacking plants were going back and forth with regulators on saying that staying 6 feet apart is not viable for our business, and so you end up having a lot of transmission of infections, and a lot of these employees in these meatpacking plants that were contracting COVID were immigrants. And so this led us towards wanting to look at Nebraska or the region. And then also, the state government fighting against local mask mandates, which also, with COVID response comes into this as well. But generally, broadly, the U.S. is a leader of COVID-19 cases and deaths around the world. And there's more severe impacts among communities of color, particularly Latino populations. And also broadly, there's a gap in what is known about how the public is perceiving risks associated with infectious disease outbreaks. And some of this makes sense. Some of these outbreaks aren't going to be as impactful as COVID-19 is around the world. And also, generally, it's hard to assume that, an outbreak is going to occur. They tend to be periodic. We had H1N1 swine flu, Ebola, SARS and avian influenza, and now COVID-19, among others. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult in order to investigate this. but generally there's increasing evidence that COVID-19 and other infectious disease outbreaks have stronger perceptions of risk and harm among Latino communities, but there's not a lot about how this identification and maybe their migration status kind of plays into this. So that's kind of where we wanted to take this. And the reality of the situation, which is hopefully, one of the first things that you might want to do if you're wanting to use qualitative data or just research in general, is kind of look at, what do we already kind of know about the situation? And so we know that racial and ethnic minorities are less likely to have health insurance and are more likely to have health conditions that are going to put them at greater risk. And they're also more likely to have insecure means of income. Some of this could, operate through like an underground economy, which, could have less regulations, particularly at a time like COVID-19, where, regulations are quite important in order to ensure that contraction and infection is not increased or spread. Minority populations also tend to have disproportionately high hospitalization rates with COVID, while also being more likely to abide by regulations, which is quite interesting. And some reasons that are given is generally like dominating presence in service industry jobs or riskier jobs during COVID-19, cultural factors like living in multi-generational homes where you may have, grandparents and great-grandparents living in the same home. And so some of those populations that are also more increasingly vulnerable to COVID-19 might be in close contacts with people who are working in jobs that they can't really remain out of contact with people. And also public perception of health risks can be influenced by a lot of anxieties or uncertainties about infection, which is quite important for COVID-19. And so we wanted to take the angle of perception of risk because it's quite a strong determinant of behavior. And, this kind of makes sense, right? If you perceive that you have a higher risk in a certain situation, you're going to have increased anxieties. You're going to change your behaviors to alter your behaviors in different ways that are going to affect, how you feel about a situation and the way that you act. So taking it from the reality of the situation, some of our motivations, we kind of began to look at some of the theories and concepts out there that can quite inform us on where to go from here with this data set. And so first, obviously what comes up is discrimination and distress within populations. So several studies have linked experience or perceived discrimination to adverse mental health outcomes or higher perceptions of health risk. Discrimination has also been directly linked towards higher scores of depression and lower levels of subjective well-being or higher distresses. And some of this discrimination or distress could lead towards a concept that the CDC actually uses called stigma or stigmatization. And that's a kind of a concept that we can then begin trying to look at ways on how we can test it. And so the stigma is a concept that is defined by the CDC, and you can find this on their website. They talk about it specifically with communities of color. And as a form of discrimination based on fears around disease and death that specifically impacts communities of color and those that have been sick with COVID-19. Which is quite interesting, those who have been sick with COVID-19 when it comes to thinking about Nebraska and the meatpacking plants, that these are immigrants who are already specifically vulnerable and have already been sick, and so they might be stigmatized even more, which kind of makes it a little bit of like a double dipping or a vicious cycle that we can kind of see. And so stigma is going to cause significant reduction in public measure compliance, distrust in public institutions, which is compounded by the higher likelihood that Latinos or immigrants have to avoid contact with certain services because of increasing number of raids, federal immigration enforcement, increasing surveillance at all levels of government. That's kind of disrupting their daily life or their sense of place in the community. Let alone, you have certain things like, as we talked about with language compliance, as we used in the survey, you have certain situations where for medical health, a first-generation immigrant might have their child who knows English at a proficient level translate for them at the doctor, and they may not talk about certain issues because their child's having to translate for them. So that's going to exacerbate health outcomes. And so health-related stigmas are generally going to have more significant adverse effects on racial or ethnic minorities. And so, stigmatization is going to cause social exclusion or retracting from regulations or from society in general and make them harder to reach, which is then, of course, going to exacerbate some of these negative health outcomes. And there's also socioeconomic situations that are at play here. Increased likelihood of Latino communities contracting infectious disease due to some of their socioeconomic situations in the country that they are living in. generally lower employment statuses, lower financial security, their immigration status being unknown or up in the air, general language difficulties they might have, or again, access to medical services. Also, immigrants are more likely to travel back and forth between their home and host country, which can cause travel-related contractions. And some of this is almost unavoidable, as if you, say, are having to renew your visa, you can't necessarily do that within the United States. So you're going to have to leave the country and then reapply, renew your visa, and then come back in, which can then, obviously it's unavoidable, and you could have travel-related contractions in that situation. Or specifically, those of Mexican heritage have reported sending remittances back to support family and friends, which could cause primary and secondary economic tensions with families, where they're being impacted kind of twice by negative economic outcomes related to COVID, as they're supporting themselves and helping support their family and friends back home. And also, generally, first and second generation immigrants tend to face more challenges economically and culturally compared to third generation immigrants. And that's not to say third generation immigrants don't have aren't impacted economically or culturally, but just that as you live in a country for longer, you see them as they're more culturally like the country that they live in, quote unquote, more Americanized or things like that. So they may have less impacts for them, which kind of helps inform our hypothesis that we have. So this is just kind of the outline, what you might see. So, we have, what we're really interested in is looking at risk of infection, risk of dying, risk of job loss, risk of running out of money. And we're particularly interested in if somebody identifies as Hispanic, Latino, or their immigration status. And then we have alternative explanations here, which are our control variables that we just kind of wanted to make sure that we are including in our research, because, it may not be that our independent variables are what's most informs our hypothesis or our findings. So we're just interested in if Latino immigrants perceive higher risk to their health or economic means during COVID-19. And so we kind of hypothesize that that identifying as Latino will increase your chance of economic or health effects, and then first or second generation immigrants will also report a higher chance of economic or health effects. So to kind of, remove some of the academic stuff from it, I'm just going to kind of go over some of our preliminary findings that we had. So if you don't include a lot of those control variables, being Hispanic or Latino is associated with greater perceived risk of infection. This is also the same for risk of dying. So from the health outcomes perspective, generally without some of the alternative explanations provided, it is, significant in that sense. However, being a first or second generation immigrant does not appear to be associated with greater perceived risk of infection. But as we include some of these other alternative explanations, we do find that some variables such as like anxiety, discrimination, or taking the survey in Spanish were positively correlated with the perceived risk of infection. But some of these results were a little bit inconclusive on the health risks. So we started to do some further analysis by subgroups, which is informed pretty well by political scientists who are saying that, there's a lot of heterogeneity within Latino populations. Latino populations and Hispanic populations are not a monolith. So we see that identifying as Mexican is associated with an increased perceived risk of infection, but identifying as Cuban is associated with a decreased perceived risk of infection. And so you can begin to kind of think of explanations for that. And some explanation that we kind of have thought of, for this is that, Cuban populations in America tend to be a little bit more on the conservative side politically, and generally are a little bit more trusting of, say, President Trump. And then as trust in President Trump was kind of used in this, as well as trust in CDC, we can kind of see that, as somebody who's trusting President Trump, who kind of was pushing back on COVID regulations or COVID seriousness, we can kind of find that, they might trust in that more and then have a perceived less risk. And then for risk of dying, a lot of the variables were very similar, as far as Hispanic, Latino being statistically significant, but consistent with earlier than like immigration status was not. And then as we did subgroup analysis, we found, again, that first or second generation Mexican individuals have an increased risk of dying, or third generation Central South American individuals are associated with increased perceived risk of dying. And then on the economic side, this was kind of run separately, so there's not really subgroup analysis on this yet. That's something that's kind of yet to be done. But we kind of found that so far that generally being, the hypothesis kind of holds up. Generally being identifying as Hispanic Latino or being a first or second generation immigrant, you're going to be associated with greater perceived risk of running out of money. or losing one's job. And then the control variables were very similar: anxiety, identifying as Native Americans, positively correlated. And then generally, things that you would expect to maybe decrease your perceived risk are there: higher household income, higher age, trust in President Trump's negative correlated. And then with risk of losing one's job, this one's quite interesting because identifying as a first or second generation immigrant is associated with the 53.7% increased perception of risk, which is pretty large compared to some of the other variables. So, there's a lot of worry about job loss for first or second generation immigrants. And then the control variables were, again, very, very similar. The only thing that's really quite interesting that's different is that trust in CDC is positively correlated, which means that if you trust more in the CDC, you're going to have a higher chance to perceive greater risk to losing your job. And then things such as like identifying as white is correlated with lower perceived risk to losing your job. And so some of the implications in the summary of kind of what we've kind of found here, there's general support for the hypothesis, especially when it comes to economic risk perceptions. But it kind of supports the idea that there's a complex relationship between race and ethnicity and immigration on health risk specifically. So it kind of supports some of these calls by political scientists that whenever you're researching Hispanic or Latino communities, especially in politics, that you pay great attention to the subgroups, the heterogeneity within these populations, because again, they're not a monolith. And being from Mexico or being from Cuba or being from Central South America, you're going to have different effects on your day-to-day life or your perceptions of your community or within politics. And another thing that's important for qualitative data is that looking at explanatory power in your models. And so we had relatively low explanatory power, which could just indicate that there are more variables that can be analyzed in the future, which can kind of greater inform where you can kind of go with this data from here. And so we've kind of looked at, maybe we could look at geographic location. Again, we were originally interested in Nebraska or the region, the greater region. So we can try and find a way to use this data set to look at, maybe COVID responses that different states or different regions have kind of generally had, to see if there's some kind of effect where if a state has a pretty bad response to COVID-19, people might have greater perceived risk. Whereas if they live in a state that has had a pretty decent response to COVID-19 at like a state or local level, that they might perceive that they trust their government, so they're not going to have as much perceived risk. And then from there, we have references that you can look at with the presentation later. But that's it. I guess I can turn it back over to Christiane. I really appreciate everybody being here and listening to us. It's a great opportunity, and I'm very happy.
Thank you very much, Dakota, and Tom and Barbara for that wonderful presentation. Now we can open up to questions from the audience. You can please add them to the Q&A window on Zoom. There's already one question there from Melanie Kipper, who asked, can you please define snowball sampling? That Teresa answered there. And while you all think about questions, I have a few questions of my own that can help us think a little bit more about this two sources: one, a qualitative use of interviews, and a quantitative use of a survey or survey data. And I basically have, I'm going to ask two questions to Teresa, one question to Barbara, and one question to Tom and Dakota. So Teresa, can you tell us a little bit about the ethical differences or different ethical approaches between qualitative and quantitative data? And also, there's always been a discussion about qualitative data not being generalizable enough and hence not providing that good information for public policy. Can you talk to us a little bit about how qualitative data is indeed useful and generalizable in a different way, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the ethical question first, if that's okay with you. Okay. So I mean, in any study that's being conducted, it should go through an institutional review board to review and approve it before it goes into the recruitment and data collection phase. And we also completed this step for our study before we went through and did interviews. Now, there's two main things I would say that would distinguish qualitative from quantitative, and again, thinking about surveys here. And the first is that in qualitative, we're usually asking participants to share a lot of information that may be sensitive, that they may not be entirely comfortable with. And so, or that it might even be, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, they're talking about clients that they have, and so they want to ensure that their clients' identities are protected. And so what we did to kind of facilitate that step, given the level of detail we asked, I mean, like I said, one of those interviews was over 3 sessions for 6 hours. That's a lot of information that we gathered. And so we let all of our participants actually review their own transcription files to make sure that nothing they shared would jeopardize the anonymity of their clients, or that they didn't want to edit anything. And I can say that, at least in our study, a number of respondents, they didn't have any changes. They reviewed it, they felt okay. And one respondent, at least one respondent, did make some edits, but they weren't substantive. They were just clarifications. And another piece when we're looking at ethical considerations here is that, again, thinking about the level of detail that we go into with participants and that we're asking them to share with us, is that that can be really, again, unpleasant. It can be sensitive. And so we have to be aware of the fact that in these interviews, that some of these legal representatives who are recalling some very traumatic experiences of their clients who had been exploited, that this can cause some vicarious victimization as well. And so we wanted to make sure that our respondents felt very comfortable, they felt safe, they felt as though they were being heard. And so that's where part of that, there's a consent process, you know, in studies anyway, but we wanted to be very clear about the types of information we were asking. And we also wanted them to know that it's okay if you can't answer this. It's okay if you want to take a break. That's totally fine with us. We want them to be comfortable. We want them to feel safe as well. And so that's different from surveys, from sending out a survey, which can also, you know, I've conducted surveys with very sensitive victimization questions. So it's not that one or the other, qualitative versus quantitative, but when we're asking people to recall some very detailed information, it can have a different effect. The kind of moving into the segue of the generalization piece, and that's an argument that's usually made, is that qualitative is oftentimes seen as being less generalizable because you have such a limited sample. But the truth is a lot of our quantitative data cannot be generalizable as well. You know, I think about surveys that I've worked on and studies that I've reviewed of doing a survey within one context, so within one school or within one community. And so does that then generalize outside of there or outside of that context? It's maybe not. There could be different kind of structural changes or impacts that could affect the overall conclusions in a different setting. But with that said, again, you know, qualitative research, the findings here, our goal was to identify these broad themes on an area that there is very little research, some case studies on this process, but nothing too substantial to go on. And so it really can have a bigger impact, I would argue, of being able to identify maybe not every single experience, but some of these broader themes that legal representatives are struggling with, that foreign national human trafficking victims are struggling with to go through this T visa process. And that can really help guide a deeper review, examination of the T visa process itself, of collaborations between legal representatives and service providers and law enforcement to make sure that we're actually adequately responding to victims, getting them the services they need, getting them the resources that they need, and offering future directions for research. So I would argue that the qualitative research can really be very impactful. And again, even if not these specific stories, but the themes could generalize, and that can have a really profound effect on how we respond to these crimes moving forward.
Thanks, Teresa. Tom, I see that you're answering the question by Daniel Wheaton. I was also thinking that Barbara could take a stab at that question.
Sure, yeah, whatever works.
So Barbara, could you please answer the question from Daniel Witten in the window? Do you want me to read it to you, or I'm going to read it for everyone?
Oh, okay.
So how do you find subgroups in the Latino community? The definition of Hispanic Latino often changes in different contexts, not to mention Nebraska and the Southwest Great Plains has a Chicano population which may not identify as Latino, even though they may be perceived as such. We're also seeing more Latinos identify as white, making some data less reliable.
Yeah, so that is a great question, right? Because the way we measure race typically has to do with how the census is structured. And it has like a different question for race and for ethnicity. So when we think about ethnicity, the question from the census is whether you identify as Hispanic or Latino. It's kind of like a yes or no question. And then there is kind of like a follow-up question that requires you to identify your country of ancestry. So this is where we can know whether respondents are from Mexico, which is where the vast majority of Mexican Americans or Latinos identify from, or whether they're from Cuba, or a series of other countries. And there is an option to say other, where this is when a lot of Chicanos self-identify as such, because there is really no category in the census to identify for Chicano. So that is the ethnicity question. And then you can have the race question, because we know that Latinos can be of any race. For historical reasons, the vast majority of Latinos identify as white, but we know that there is this growing movement of raising awareness of Afro-Latinos. So there is this growing trend of Latinos identifying as descendants of African Americans or Black. So this is how we identify Latinos, and it is kind of like the standard way that the U.S. Census does it, and a lot of surveys do that, do so in such a way.
Thanks, Barbara. I also wanted to ask you about using the ACS and the census in a state with small population or with a small Latino population. You know that we all know that Nebraska's population is about 1.9 million, and about 14 to 15% of those are Latinos. And the ACS is a sample-based survey, which means that only a proportion of those 1.9 million people are interviewed for the survey. So what can be done, or what are some of the issues of applying or using the ACS for analyzing Latinos in Nebraska?
Yeah, so it is a little bit of an issue. However, the ACS does a tremendous job with weights. We know that the rural population is a lot less smaller, as you were talking, Christian. So when you start piecing it apart, like in the case of Nebraska, we're probably going to have really small sample sizes. But ACS does a tremendous job, not only with the weights that they use to give kind of like to make sure that underrepresented communities, in this case, Latinos in rural areas, for example, are properly counted. But ACS is also based on, like, they build in each other. Like, even though the ACS is conducted every single year, sometimes you can access data for the past year, which is a lot less reliable than the ACS data from the past 5 years. So this is how the census does it. The question about human mobility, it's quite interesting, right? Because we ask about recent migration. How the census asks the migration question, it's whether this person, whether the person that is responding the survey has lived in the same house or apartment in the past year. And then obviously there is a yes or no option. And then it has a follow-up question in case people say, yes, I live somewhere else. And then you have the option to provide, you know, the name of the city or zip code or even country if it's out of the US. So getting this type of data, the internal migration or human mobility data, it's a little bit complicated, right? Because we know that moving from house to house in the same block is going to be entirely different from moving to another county or to moving to another state or even a country. So I wanted to bring awareness to that question, because when we think about migration, in the ACS, they're talking about recent migration. And just to give you a sense of human mobility within the United States using the ACS data, here in the state of Nebraska, the vast majority of us have lived in the same house or the same residence for the past year. In fact, for the most recent data point from ACS, 84% of Nebraskans are not like recent migrants as they define, moving or changing residence within the past year. Among the others that are recent migrants, 15% of Nebraskans have changed residence within the past year, but only 2.7% of Nebraskans have moved to a different state. So if we start piecing apart, one of the determinants of health is where migrants go. So it's when we think about health and migration, specifically internal migration, it's going to be entirely different analyzing migrants that move within cities or within a state, which is 15% of Nebraskans in the past most recent data point, as opposed to the almost 3% of Nebraskans that move to another state.
Thank you, Barbara. Tom and Dakota, what you presented the results based on a nationwide survey, which is wonderful. But I was wondering, why would it be useful for Nebraska and Iowa practitioners, for example, to look or to analyze nationwide data? How it's applicable that to a more local environment?
Thanks, Christian. I think this is a very good question. And I think there are two main reasons that I think it's quite useful, particularly in the context of COVID-19, to look at comparative research. Firstly, I think having comparative research and having comparisons across the whole country provides a bit of a baseline. We've seen a lot of the response to COVID-19, a lot of data has been presented in news outlets and by the CDC and Johns Hopkins data sets, looking at state-by-state responses and regional responses. And I think having the ability to put the Nebraska and Iowa and I guess the Great Plains area in perspective by comparing to other regions across the country is really useful. So we can see how experiences and effects of COVID-19 vary by state, by region, by city. I also think, one of the things that has come out of the COVID-19 pandemic has been that there's been such a wide variation across the country. And so being able to put it in context is a useful thing. And there are statistical tools that can be used to do this, things like multi-level regression with post-stratification. And there are a variety of other models that can be used as well to analyze effects by region or by place, by state. And so again, this data set in particular, the UAS data set, is really clean and easy to use. They also include sample weights and things like that, so that these comparisons are really useful in putting the Nebraska response and the Iowa response and the effects on the populations in these regions, in these states, in context. And so we might be able to identify things that need further work, different effects on populations in this region versus others. And so from my point of view, it's quite useful to have this comparative research.
I would just like to add as well, or just emphasize, that particularly with this data set that we have, there is where it's listed, what observations you have from different states. And, this varies depending on the state and the general population, but there is, the ability with this data set to actually take it and, kind of as Tom was saying, create like the Great Plains as a region, or Iowa and Nebraska, and like South and North Dakota or something like that, you know, something that's regionally viable in order for us to go forward with kind of, as we were saying, like the geographic location that we would like to maybe take this as like another variable that we can then include to hopefully, you know, narrow it down in that way that we're, you know, kind of talking about, that we can investigate Nebraska a little bit more, or Iowa a little bit more closely.
Thanks, Tom and Dakota. Is there any other questions that people in the public would like to ask? I don't have any more questions on the Q&A. Josie?
I have one, and I'm not allowed to put into the Q&A. I should work on that. I'm struck by the fact that you are all researching people during very vulnerable periods in their lifetime. And I'm wondering what draws you to study those folks in that time and that place. And then how large is the body of evidence on these topics? How confident can we be when policymakers are asking us questions about vulnerable people in these difficult situations to provide solutions? How much evidence do we have on this important topic, on all of these important topics? So it's to everyone. Maybe we'll go in the order that you presented. And Christiane, I'd love to hear from you too on that.
So I'll start. And I would say I'm thinking about human trafficking. And so although human trafficking has been recognized as a criminal offense since 2000 in this country, we've undergone a lot of changes in our legislation, particularly with the classification of minors as trafficking victims. And I would say probably within the last 10 years, we've been able to start getting more solid data, a better understanding. We moved a lot, you know, I'm thinking about like this historical timeline of research on trafficking, going from statistical projections to actually working with victims, working with people, law enforcement, legal representatives to better understand these crimes. And so your question is such a good one, but so difficult to answer as well, because depending on the area in human trafficking of what can inform policy, I would say some things we know about better than others, such as a lot of times victims, particularly of sex trafficking, are arrested for things like prostitution, promoting prostitution. And this can disproportionately affect people of color as well. And so we know a little bit more about that, but then in the policy implications for labor trafficking, there's still a lot of unknowns because we've just not done enough research in that area to provide some of these implications. And so I think we're on a good path going forward, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. And so that's why I'm so excited about this study, working with legal representatives to kind of open up one of those avenues of research even more.
Yeah, so for me, it's really important. Obviously, I study health, right? And when we think about health, it is important to know the general patterns of how health outcomes are affecting Americans. But for me, you cannot understand how policies impact populations unless you analyze how minority groups are impacted by such policies. So of course, it's important to know whether a policy is being cost effective, whether the policy is going in the right direction, but we also need to understand how policies and phenomena like COVID-19 are affecting the most vulnerable communities, who are usually the ones that struggle the most because of their precarious conditions that are often systemically, they face them systemically, right? So to me, it is very important to not just understand the trends, but also to dig deeper and analyze minority groups, whether it is immigrants, communities of color, sexual minorities, and so on. So yeah, that's what I do, this type of research. And when we think about the state of Nebraska, we also have to care about the growing diversity of the state. What does that mean for public policy? What does that mean for policymakers? Because if you take a look at the growing patterns of diversity across the United States, There is a growing diversity in the state of Nebraska. Some counties have an incredible diversity growth in the past decade. So if you are doing policymaker policies, or you're a policymaker in the state of Nebraska, or if you're a policy practitioner dealing with Nebraskans, it is important to think about this growing diversity and these vulnerable groups, or potentially vulnerable groups in the case of migrants, whether they're international migrants or whether they're domestic migrants.
So I kind of came into this area of research just generally from working with, so I come from the state of Kentucky, a place called Bowling Green, and there's a large refugee population there, which I was able to work with, you know, a lot of refugees from like war and strife. So, you know, like Bosnian Civil War, there's a lot of Bosnians in Bowling Green. And so I came in from working with that, but also generally, you know, from a policy angle, you know, whenever you're conducting policy, for the most part, you know, you hope that it's reaching, you know, when you're structuring a policy, it's addressing the most vulnerable populations, which especially in some of these health crises like this tend to be, you know, immigrants or, you know, communities of color, you know, populations that generally, as Barbara was saying, you know, are systemically hindered in this process more so than others. And so, you know, that's kind of generally where I come from and come into this research, especially in a situation like COVID-19, where, you know, it's so politicized in a sense. And so there's a lot of divergent opinions that people tend to have on, you know, how things are being affected or what's real and what's not. So being able to kind of try and find a way to cut through that so that these vulnerable populations are not, you know, are left unaddressed in COVID-19 is quite important to me. And as far as, you know, what research is kind of out there, there tends to be a good amount on certain economic conditions. That tends to be a focus that people try and take when it comes to this. So when it comes to other outcomes like, you know, perceptions of risk or, you know, health outcomes, that tends to be an area that still needs to have some research done into. So, you know, there's a long way to kind of go, but as Teresa was saying, you know, I think that it's come a long way and it's going in a positive direction. But it also kind of depends on what group that you're working with, depends on how much available data that you have. So if you're working with, say, Latino populations, you know, there's some out there and it's growing, but they still need some work that's done. But if you're working with populations such as, you know, indigenous populations, you know, Native Americans, you know, there's not a lot. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done with different populations in order to kind of address some systemic issues that they might face, especially in some of these health crises.
Thanks, Josie. Yeah, I think my motivation for this kind of project comes out of my experience and research in emergency management and disaster research. So actually the beginnings of this project a couple of years ago was thinking about disasters and climate change and how that affects human mobility. And then with obviously the pandemic, we've kind of transitioned a little bit to look at COVID-19, seeing that is what's going on right now and perhaps the most, you know, pressing thing in people's lives. And so, you know, that's our kind of background to this and just understanding how people experience crisis and how they might respond to it as well. And hopefully, you know, there'll be better policies put in place to prepare for and prevent the same kind of level of effects as this event. In terms of, yeah, I think just reiterating what other panelists have said, I think there's a lot more work to be done, and you know, no single study is ever going to really capture the whole reality of people's experiences. But I think, you know, there's a lot of work being done, obviously at the moment, and will continue to be done over the coming years. So I think even though, especially with COVID-19, I think, you know, we're only really scratching the surface. I hope that in future years we'll learn a lot more and you know, be able to build back better as a result of this.
Thanks, Josie, and thanks to my colleagues who presented today. I have about a minute and a half to give an answer that will take me 3 days. I've been working on migration for about 20 years now, since I graduated since my undergrad years. And the traditional view of a perfectly voluntary migrant and a perfectly forced migrant is more and more blurred. And now we have, in the case of the Americas, a set of crises that are inducing people to migrate. We have political change and political crisis in Venezuela. We have the ongoing security crisis in the Northern Triangle. We have ongoing and increasing environmental crisis in different parts that have increased out migration. And we also have local, as we were trying to do with Tom, 3 years ago, local climate change or climate crisis that would induce to either increase vulnerability on migrants and minorities or increase internal migration. And in one sense, in other research that we're doing at OIAS, we've seen that the state has, the government has moved away from addressing these issues and have given this to civil society, third sector organizations, NGOs, however you want to call it. But it's still, we need a frame, a legal frame or a governmental frame that will explain how these organizations can work. And that's another research that we're doing with Teresa and other two colleagues. So there's a new environment in which you study vulnerability, immigration, internal migration, that is done by this critical moment, if you wish. And there's a lot to be say, and there's a lot to be done regionally. We have a wonderful place here in Nebraska, both CPACs, OIAs, Teresa's team, Tom's environment, emergency management program. I'm saying it's yours, but we know it's more than that, that we can influence change at the regional level. And personally, that's one of the things that I'm looking for with all these projects, how we create data to develop regional change. So with that, again, thank you very much. Thank to all the attendees, and thank you, Josie, for inviting us to this panel.
Thank you all for spending the morning with us. Thank you, panelists. I'm just honored to work at a university with you, all of you. You are building such important evidence to help build better governance, build better communities, and I just appreciate learning and sharing with you this morning. So we will be using